Hello, this is the final video of the session for my novella and long story course for Lindenwood University. And mainly I want to talk about just some various sort of options in terms of novella writing and some novellas to read if you want some further examples of long story slash novellas to read, etc. As you know, we finished up the session with Toni Morrison's short novel Home, which most of us, if not all of us, found very much to our liking. I very much enjoy the little novel. It is a revisionist work in itself, and as you know, I'm particularly interested in revisionist work. So it plays with Homer's Odyssey, to be sure, and I think a little bit of Iliad is tossed into the mix as well. And then it does all the sorts of things that Toni Morrison tends to do, which I really love, including real historical events being discussed within the fiction. So there's a historical fiction aspect to it. And then incorporating the supernatural, particularly ghosts. That's something that Toni Morrison has done regularly in her fiction. I just enjoy all of that sort of thing, right? And so I thought for the first book I would suggest is in a sense a brand new one, but in a sense not really. It's Toni Morrison's recitative. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's a musical term, but it's a story. It's very, very brief. It was Toni Morrison's only short story that she wrote. Everything else she wrote was a novel, but this has recently been reissued as a standalone story with an introduction by Zadie Smith, which is really interesting in and of itself, and talking about not just this story, but Toni Morrison's work, in general. But if you were a Toni Morrison fan and you haven't read Recitative, I would recommend getting a hold of this little book and checking it out. Like I said, it's a fast read, obviously, because it is just kind of a long short story. I had taught this story years and years ago as part of an anthology that I was using for a college course, and when I saw Toni Morrison recitative, I absolutely had to make sure that was part of the reading list. And so when it came out by itself with, like I said, this new introduction by Zadie Smith, it was a must-have, and I have it. All right. So I want to share with you some other novellas that, again, come recommended, highly recommended. Earlier in the session, I talked about this book, Writing the Novella, by Sharon Ord Warner, and I don't know that I would say that, gosh, if you get this book, you will master the novella. She says a lot of really interesting, useful things, but I don't know that they specifically apply to just the novella. I think just writing fiction in general, writing novels also. I would, if you're into craft books, especially books that focus on writing fiction and longer narrative fiction, I would definitely encourage you to maybe check it out. Again, I don't know that it truly just would lead you to write a novella necessarily. So who knows? Maybe it would lead you to write really interesting stuff, whether it's a long story or a full length novel. Who knows? But it does have some worthwhile stuff in it, including lists of different novellas that the author recommends. So I was just going to share some of those with you. Sorry, I want to make sure I've got the right pages here. And she gives a little synopsis of each of the books, and maybe some of those I'll read and some not. And then after I share that with you, I'll just share some of my own picks, which actually overlap a bit with hers, but that's okay. So here are some books, three books that the author references frequently in this how-to manual. One is Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton, published in 1911. It says, though a minor publication in her lifetime, Ethan Frome is her most enduring work. A frame narrative or story within a story, the novella depicts one fateful week in the life of a man who is trapped between his sense of duty and his desperate love for a young woman he's about to lose. All right. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, both one of my favorite, I think of it as a novel, but novella perhaps, and one of my favorite authors, Ray Bradbury, who's an Illinois guy. And I'm an Illinois guy, I've got that sort of affinity. But it says, in contrast to Edith Wharton, Ray Bradbury grew up poor. His family was itinerant because his father was always struggling to find a decent paying job. Bradbury had this to say about his education. When I graduated from high school, it was during the Depression, and we had no money. I couldn't go to college, so I went to the library 3 days a week for 10 years. Fahrenheit 451, as you may know, is a dystopian novella about a society where the job of a fireman is incinerating books. Winner of the 1954 American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, the novella has been read by generations of middle school and high school students. In addition to several film adaptations, Fahrenheit 451 has also inspired a stage play and a video game. Great book, whether you want to call it a novella or a novel. And sadly contemporary, meaning that book banning is on the rise again. I even hear conservatives talking about literally burning books and wanting to burn books. Unfortunately, it's a topic that is, just as relevant today as when Bradbury wrote the story originally. But Fahrenheit 451, great choice. The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. Not a book that I have read, although also an Illinois person. Her parents struggled to support 7 children, we're told, whenever life in the Chicago barrio got too hard. Cisneros' father packed up the family and returned for a few months to his childhood home, Mexico City. Despite many obstacles, Sandra Cisneros received her bachelor's degree from Loyola and her MFA from the renowned Iowa Writers' Workshop. Based in part on the author's childhood experiences, The House on Mango Street has resonated with legions of readers and won critical acclaim. Right, and so there are 3 books that this author, references repeatedly in this book, but here are some other recommendations. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, 1956, the groundbreaking gay love story of an expatriate in Paris. Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote, 1958. A writer recalls his beloved and beautiful neighbor Holly Golightly. I love Breakfast at Tiffany's. In fact, the movie version with George Peppard and oh my gosh, Katharine Hepburn? No. Stop. Pause. Audrey Hepburn, not Catherine. I knew Catherine was wrong. Audrey came to me, though, but I did verify that. Anyway, the film version of Breakfast at Tiffany's with George Peppard and Audrey Hepburn maybe was one of the movies I saw as a kid that made me want to be a writer. And then, years and years later, I actually read the novella, and it's pretty phenomenal. Another recommendation. Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, 2002, a remarkable science fiction story that probes humanity's fundamental questions. Van Gogh's A Room at Arles by Stanley Elkin in 1993. Fun fact, Stanley Elkin was a friend and colleague of the master, William Gass, at Washington University. But this is a middle-aged community college instructor is lodged in a room made famous by Vincent van Gogh. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, 1925. Again, one of those books that I've always thought of as a novel, but recently people talk of it as a novella. It says, to attract the attention of a woman he loved and lost, a mysterious millionaire throws extravagant parties. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon, 2003. Solving the mystery of a dead dog becomes all-consuming for a 15-year-old boy on the autism spectrum. I'm familiar with that book, but I haven't read it. It's one of those books I think I probably ought to read. The Old Man and the Sea, of course, by Ernest Hemingway, 1952. I won't read the description because we know all about that. The Dead by James Joyce, 1914, widely considered a masterpiece. The Dead is set in Dublin at Christmas time. I'm going to say more about that later. A River Runs Through It by Norman Maclean, 1977. One brother remembers the tragic death of another in this semi-autobiographical Montana story brought to the screen by Robert Redford. Death in Venice, a book I really, really enjoyed when I was working on my master's. I took a course in European literature, and we read Death in Venice by Thomas Mann, the German author, 1912. A blocked writer makes an ill-advised visit to Venice and falls under the spell of a beautiful boy. The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers, 1946. Coming of age meets Southern Gothic in this tale of a lonely tomboy obsessed with her sister's upcoming wedding. I have not read it, but my wife actually read this about a month ago, and she really, really enjoyed it. So I definitely, again, one of those books I feel I better read. This book I have read, On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan, 2011. It's 1962 and the wedding night of two virgins in a honeymoon suite on Chesil Beach. I'm a big Ian McEwan fan, so when this book first came out, I gobbled it right up, and it really was, it was a good one. I definitely recommend. Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, 1966. You know all about that. Hand of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, 1937. The story follows two Depression-era migrant field workers, one the protector of the other, as they try their luck at yet another farm. So there are several recommendations, and actually later in this book, the author gives even more recommendations, which I won't, read per se. But the other thing that they do, or she does, I should say, is give a list of contests for novellas, and then also presses that publish novellas. So both of those could be useful bits of information if you are thinking of writing the novella. All right. So anyway, like I said, I think the book is worthwhile for many reasons. Although I don't know necessarily that it is a guaranteed, sort of thing to do to write a novella, right? I think it's got good stuff in it, but whether it actually leads to you writing a novella is another question altogether, right? So I want to share some other books with you, and I might pause from time to time because I got a big stack over here. And so, just to kind of grab the right thing. So I think, I'm going to pause for just a second. All right, so in an earlier version of this class, when the sessions were longer, one of the books that I had students read because I really, really, admire the heck out of it, almost doesn't really fit with this long story and novella course, but I included it anyway because I just liked it so much, and that's Brokeback Mountain by Annie Proulx. I say it doesn't really fit because it's actually just kind of almost a medium length short story. It's about 6,000 words or so. I did the counting myself. I think it's around 6,000 words. But just a tremendous story, and you're probably familiar with the movie that came out, which was sort of groundbreaking and controversial and so forth. But it's just a beautiful story, beautifully written. And like I said, very, very brief. So, if you'd like to read something that's a very quick read, but phenomenal, I would recommend Brokeback Mountain. All right. So there are, novellas that if you go back in time, are particularly good to read. We read The Death of Ivan Ilyich and other stories. You can get collections of Tolstoy that has other stories that are sort of in that long story novella length. And this particular collection has 3 Tolstoy stories, all of which I really, really like and admire, and could include any of them in this class. The Cartesian Sonata is really, really good. And Master and Man is another great Tolstoy kind of long story, and there are others. But if you liked The Death of Ivan Ilyich, you might want to get a hold of some kind of collection of Tolstoy's other shorter works. We obviously tend to associate him with War and Peace and Anna Karenina, but wrote short stories and long stories and novellas also. So that's something you could turn to. Another Russian writer who wrote a lot of long stories and novellas, even though, again, we tend to think of him based on his longer works, is, of course, Dostoevsky. And you can find, collections of his shorter works like this one here. So the book itself is pretty long, but each story in itself is pretty readable, kind of like a long story or novella length. The Double is well known and just talked about a lot. Notes from the Underground, of course, you've probably heard of if you haven't read already. White Knights is another really good one. So anyway, if you're into the Russian writers and don't want to tackle War and Peace or Crime and Punishment or the Brothers Karamazov or something, try some Dostoevsky's shorter works. Right. Going to pause again here. The other author had mentioned The Dead, which of course is part of James Joyce's Dubliners, his collection of stories. The Dead is the final story, and it is a sort of standalone piece in itself. In fact, you can find it published by itself. I know I've seen critical editions of just The Dead, not as part of Dubliners, because it is a sort of standalone novella. Great, great story in and of itself. Obviously, if you read it as part of the whole collection, it has even more sort of meaning and impact, I think, because even though this is a collection of stories and a novella, Joyce definitely had an agenda and a sort of artistic agenda and strategy for the entire book. And so it's really something you should read together. You probably have encountered different stories from Dubliners. They're widely anthologized. I know I have encountered Araby on several occasions. Eveline, it shows up in a lot of anthologies, as does A Painful Case. Others you'll find here and there. But anyway, there's the list, right? And Joyce, like all of his books, had trouble finding a publisher for Dubliners. It took him several years. It was on the verge of being published, on 2 or 3 occasions, and then the publisher got cold feet for one reason or another because of, some fears of prosecution for obscenity and things like that. And in retrospect, we're probably lucky that Joyce had such trouble getting it published, because it actually grew by several stories. And so by the time it was published, it was longer than the original manuscript intended for it to be. And one of the pieces that was added later was The Dead. So if it had been published originally, it would have been still great, but not as great as what it ended up being. So James Joyce and Dubliners. Another older work, which I highly recommend, is Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. It's maybe a ghost story. It's creepy, whether you think of it as a ghost story or not, but very, very good. This is a critical edition, so most of this is not the story. It's actually very, very brief, just a little novella, but widely read. I mean, Henry James was prolific and has lots of novels and novellas and short stories and essays and literary criticism and plays and on and on and on that are read still today pretty rigorously. But The Turn of the Screw probably has gotten the most attention of all of his work because of its complexity, because we're not quite sure what it's about. It's just one of those stories that people are really drawn to, even though you can't say sort of definitively what even is going on in the story necessarily. So I definitely recommend The Turn of the Screw. Some other options here. One of the courses that I'm adding to my repertoire at Lindenwood, and it's on the schedule for this fall, is a course on Vladimir Nabokov's work. Nabokov, you may know as the author of Lolita, highly controversial and sensational book featuring pedophilia, which made Nabokov both infamous and extremely wealthy. But long before he wrote Lolita, he'd been writing for about 30 years, writing and publishing for about 30 years. Most of that time in the pre-Lolita days was spent writing and publishing in Russian. So my course that I suggested to Lindenwood, which they have added to the schedule, is a course which focuses exclusively on Nabokov's Russian work. Obviously, we're going to read it in translation. But one of the pieces that we're going to read was Nabokov's very first work of fiction. First book length worth of work of fiction that he published, which is translated to the title Mary, but it is a very short little novel. Again, more of a novella, just beautifully written. It is an episodic or sort of little vignette kind of novella where the main character is remembering his experiences with this young lady when they were younger and kind of over the years and so forth. And so we kind of, it's a frame narrative, so we kind of go in and out of the frame frequently, but it's a beautiful little book, Mary, and it really put Nabokov on the map. He was only in his 20s when he wrote and published this book, but everyone knew something amazing had happened and that he was going to be a force in literature. And like I said, eventually he switched to writing in English. Kind of his second half of his career, he wrote exclusively in English. But then when he became famous for Lolita, he had the wherewithal to be able to have his Russian works published in English. A couple of them had been translated before that, but most of them had not. And he worked on the translations himself. In part, a lot of times his son Dmitri was sort of the main translator. Then he worked in conjunction with his dad. So it's interesting because a lot of times works in translation, the original author had nothing to do with the translation. But in this case, Nabokov definitely had a hand in the translation and so forth. Speaking of Nabokov and Lolita, this is an interesting little book, The Enchanter. It is sometimes talked about as sort of I don't know, sort of an early version of Lolita, but it's a long story novella that Nabokov wrote when he was still writing in Russian. And he liked it, but it got lost. He Before it got published, it just disappeared. You know, he was moving around a lot at the time. Um, you know, uh, Europe was about to be engaged in World War II. Nabokov's wife, Vera, was Jewish, and so they kept kind of moving around. They were in Berlin when Hitler first came to power, so they had to get out of there. And so they were moving around a lot, and in the course of all that, he lost the manuscript. He eventually wrote Lolita, and then again, after he became well known, his papers were wanted by various libraries, and so the Library of Congress wanted his manuscripts, his early drafts and letters and things. And in going through boxes and boxes of stuff, he discovered the manuscript for The Enchanter. And he had always kind of thought about it as sort of a failed attempt at writing Lolita, but when he reread it, he realized, this is actually a pretty darn good little story in and of itself. So his son worked on translating it, and this was eventually published as a standalone book, The Enchanter. But a really, really interesting book, and particularly if you like Lolita, it is an interesting book to read because it definitely has those sort of same seeds of inspiration that eventually grew into that kind of groundbreaking, novel. All right, so Nabokov, and he has other shorter works, shorter novels. In fact, all of his novels are kind of on the short side. So many of them are sort of in the novella range themselves. All right. You're not going in super strict chronology here, so I'm taking a little bit of a step back. But another one of my favorite novellas is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Fun fact, we mispronounce the name Jekyll. It's an old Scottish name, and so when Robert Louis Stevenson chose it, he was trying to play with the idea of hide and seek, Hyde and Jekyll, and people in Scotland knew how to pronounce the name when the book was published. But when it was published in the US, we immediately got it wrong and started calling it Jekyll and Hyde, and the name is just sort of stuck. So you can show that you're in the know next time you reference this book by referring to it as The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But very thin little novella, but a page turner. Written just as Freud's theories about personality and the ego and the id and all of that sort of thing were first kind of coming into, being widely discussed and so forth. And so if you're interested in psychology and the history of psychology, this book definitely kind of fits into that time frame as well, frame of reference, I guess I should say. And so definitely recommend The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Haven't mentioned too many, non-English texts. I mentioned the Russians. One of my favorite Mexican authors is Carlos Fuentes. I don't know if you're familiar with Fuentes. He was a postmodernist. I think was. I'm not sure if he's still alive or not. I should check that out. But a postmodernist writing, again in Mexico. And so his books are available in translation. And this is one of his books that I really, really like called Aura. And this is a bilingual edition. So the facing pages have Spanish and then the English translation on the other side. And so if you speak Spanish or sort of do, then that's kind of interesting in and of itself. But so even though, I mean, this is pretty narrow anyway, but so really it's only half the length here because half of this is Spanish and the other half is English. But it's a great story. It's creepy as all get out. And let me read sort of the publisher's description. It says, Aura, Carlos Fuentes' novella of horror and beauty, is now reissued in a bilingual format. It is a brilliant tour de force involving a young scholar, Felipe Montero, who is employed in the house of an aged widow to edit her deceased husband's memoirs. And it goes on from there. But I'm not going to say any more because I think that's enough. Oh my gosh, this creeped the heck out of me when I read it the first time. And I highly recommend this little novella, Aura, by Carlos Fuentes. All right. I'm into the beats. I don't know if any of you are, but Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Corso and William Burroughs, and on and on. And a lot of their work is on the shorter side. And this is one of Kerouac's shorter novels that I really, really like, The Subterraneans. And it's highly autobiographical. Of course, Kerouac's work tended to be highly autobiographical. And so if you kind of know the other writers and artists and so forth that Kerouac hung out with in his youth, you will see them mirrored here in the text, with different names, of course, but thinly veiled. That's a good way of putting it. So anyway, this is a fun read just in and of itself. But again, if you kind of know that beat group of writers and artists and so forth, they often, several of them show up in the Subterraneans, in a slightly different form. So really, really recommend this. Again, Kerouac wrote several novella-length works. Satori in Paris is another of my favorites. I didn't grab it off my bookshelf, but if you search Kerouac's bibliography, you'll see that again he wrote several short novels, novellas, that kind of thing. So that may be something of interest to you if you like the Beat Generation and all that kind of work. All right. Getting down to brass tacks here. Before I finish with a flurry, I'll mention that the only book of my own that I published, strictly speaking, as a novella is Weeping with an Ancient God. This is a revisionist work. It is a sort of fictionalized biography of the author Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick and lots of other stuff as well. He wrote a sort of fictionalized autobiography about his experiences as a sailor on this particular island in the Marquesas, called Typee. And so my novella is kind of a revision of Typee, but also just kind of a revisionist, biography of Melville, etc. This book is important for me because I had a publisher that published my first novel, Men of Winter, and then 2 or 3 years later, they were going to publish Weeping with an Ancient God and Other Stories. And it was on the verge of being published. I mean, I spent months revising the manuscript and then editing and revising the proof pages, and it literally was ready to go to press, even though it's kind of an anachronistic term with digital publication these days, when the publisher and I got into a bit of a beef, and they pulled the plug. They just refused to publish it. And that really was the impetus for my starting my own press, 12 Winters Press, because I didn't want to ever go through anything like that again. And so, and among other reasons, I look to this book as, the book that really kind of encouraged me to do what I'd been thinking about doing for years, which was starting my own press. And so I did. And one of the first books I brought out was Weeping with an Ancient God, but without the other stories. However, I wanted to make it a little bit different. And so I was friendly with an artist in town, still am, I guess. We just haven't talked for a long time. But a gentleman by the name of Adam Perschbacher, a really talented artist. And so I asked Adam if he would want to do some original illustrations for the novella, and he did. So every so often there is a black and white illustration which Adam did, and they're really, really interesting, and I really enjoyed, working with Adam on the book, and enjoyed his illustrations and so forth. And it was interesting to sort of see what he thought was kind of worthy of artistic rendering. So the illustrations that he did weren't necessarily ones that I would pinpoint as uh, the key moments in the book, although some of them were particularly important. This one, for example. But anyway, ended up publishing Weeping with an Ancient God with these original illustrations from Adam. And, like all my books, hardly anyone read it. But it got some good reviews. Chicago Book Review named it a best book of 2015. And so that was cool. So anyway, I just wanted to plug my own novella while I was at it. So, but I really want to finish with the master, of course. As I've probably mentioned elsewhere during this course, William Gass felt like the novella was his natural form. He wrote some novels and he wrote some short stories, but he really felt like, as a writer, his sort of artistic vision fit, most naturally into the novella form. Longer than a short story, but not a full-length novel anyway. Not a full-length novel, and so he wrote several novellas. Now, even his novels, like Omen Setter's Luck and The Tunnel, are sort of like groups of related novellas strung together, right? But otherwise, there were a bunch of novellas. His very first collection, which came out in 1968, In the Heart of the Country and Other Stories, is a little bit deceiving because among the works in here are actually two novellas. One is the title novella story, In the Heart of the Country, which is the first thing I read by Gass and just absolutely fell in love at first reading. I read it in an anthology of postmodern American fiction, but it's obviously included in this collection. And then the novella, The Peterson Kid, is also in this collection, and just a tremendous story. I've taught The Peterson Kid many times, and it just works really well. Gass eventually got to the point where he wasn't super interested in plot, but he wasn't quite there yet when he wrote The Peterson Kid, so it has a really interesting page-turning plot. So I often recommend people starting with this book if they want to get into Gass, because it has stories like The Peterson Kid, novellas like The Peterson Kid, which are real page-turners, right? But he did other collections of novellas. This is they're all one of my favorites, but Cartesian Sonata and Other Novellas by William H. Gass. A collection of 4 novellas. All of them are really wonderful stuff. And so if you're particularly into novellas and want to check out a master of the form, I would definitely recommend getting a hold of Cartesian Sonata. Another collection that came out, and this was his last book of fiction, was Eyes, and it says it's novellas and stories. It actually has 2 novellas in it, and it's kind of interesting. I guess, history. He actually was working on another collection like Cartesian Sonata that was going to be a collection of 3 novellas, all with titles starting with the letter C. And one of them, which was the second story, so he called it Middle C, just kind of got out of hand, and it became a novel unto itself. And so his vision of another collection of novellas kind of fell apart because one of them got away from him and became a full-blown 300 and some page novel. Well, he eventually finished the other 2 novellas, and then it was published with a handful of other kind of short stories and experimental sketches and things in Eyes, but really, really good. And then speaking of experimental, in 1968, Gass published Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife, which is a highly, highly experimental novella. It originally was published by Tri-Quarterly Literary Journal as a supplement to the magazine, and then Knopf eventually published it in hardback. But he plays a lot with typeface, with just unusual little things, going on in the text. And there's photographs in here that not that Gass took, although he was a photographer, a very good photographer, but photographs that kind of work to illustrate the text as well. So Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife is another a really interesting choice if you're looking for novellas to read. All right, so I will stop there. Those are just some recommendations. I'm sure you have some recommendations of your own. So maybe if you want to either agree with some of these recommendations or add some new titles, some other titles to the list, that might be a good way to comment on this video. But otherwise, I'll just say that I really enjoyed working with you this session, and I look forward to seeing you down the digital trail.